Picture this, a 16-year-old French kid, stuck in a tiny village, bored beyond belief, starts scribbling down ideas for a story. Flash forward 22 years. That story becomes a $90 million movie. The most expensive European production ever filmed. A visual explosion of neon, latex, and pure cinematic insanity. American critics hated it. Audiences in the US ignored it. 63 million domestic on a 90 million budget textbook bomb. But here's the twist. The rest of the world went absolutely feral for it. $200 million internationally. Teenage fans memorizing every line. Cosplayers recreating costumes 25 years later. And behind all that chaos, a director who left his wife, who was literally in the movie, for his 21-year-old star. A music legend who rejected a role because the fishnets were too revealing. A forklift that nearly destroyed the film's most iconic scene. An indoor explosion so massive it took half an hour to extinguish. Welcome to The Fifth Element, where nothing made sense, where everything was on fire, sometimes literally, where Bruce Willis and Gary Oldman somehow starred in the same film but never met. Let's pull back the curtain. From teenage daydream to blockbuster nightmare. Luc Besson was not your typical teenager. While other kids were playing sports or chasing girls, he was drowning in isolation. His parents were professional scuba instructors, constantly traveling, and Besson spent his childhood essentially underwater, both literally and emotionally. At 16, desperately needing an escape from his lonely existence, he started writing. Not just ideas, not just notes, a full narrative universe. What would eventually become The Fifth Element started as something closer to a fantasy novel than a film treatment. He created entire alien species, constructed languages from scratch, drew cityscapes, imagined weapons, built religions and political systems for worlds that existed only in his notebooks. This wasn't a weekend project. This consumed him for over 2 decades. By the time he was making waves in French cinema with films like Subway and La Femme Nikita, that teenage manuscript was still evolving. Even while filming Leon the Professional in 1994, he kept refining this obsessive passion project. The French National Film School had rejected him years earlier, told him his influences were too American, too Spielberg, too mainstream. But Besson didn't care. He had a universe to build. When The Fifth Element finally hit theaters in 1997, Besson was 38. More than 2 decades had passed since that bored teenager first put pen to paper. What started as one kid's coping mechanism became one of the most divisive, expensive, and ultimately influential sci-fi films ever made. The impossible script that had to be slaughtered. Here's the problem with obsessively building a fictional universe for 20 years. It gets out of control. Besson's original draft was over 400 pages. For context, most feature film scripts are 90 to 120 pages. His was literally 4 movies worth of material. And it wasn't just long, it was sprawling. Multiple planets, dozens of fully developed alien cultures, political intrigue spanning galaxies. He'd written backstories for characters who'd appear on screen for 30 seconds. Co-writer Robert Mark Kamen later said it was 180 pages, and then he added a second part to it, which made no sense either. The plan, split it into 2 films, make it a duology, maybe even a trilogy. Studios took one look at the budget projections approaching $100 million and laughed them out of the room. Too weird, too French, too expensive, too risky. So Besson made a brutal choice. He carved out everything but the core, trimmed 400 pages down to around 120, slashed the budget to 90 million. Still insane by European standards, but theoretically producible. Entire planets got deleted. Full character arcs vanished. Alien civilizations he'd spent years developing never made it to screen. What we got was essentially the second act of a much longer story. The meat without the full meal. And years later, when people asked about sequels, Besson said no. The film had underperformed in America. Studios weren't interested. The larger story would remain locked away forever. So The Fifth Element exists as this strange, overstuffed artifact, a fraction of a vision too big to contain. The legend who said, "Even I have limits." Ruby Rhode is one of the most memorable characters in sci-fi cinema. Flamboyant, loud, chaotic, dripping in leopard print and sexual energy. Chris Tucker made that role iconic. But he wasn't supposed to. The role was written for Prince. Think about that. The artist formerly known as Prince. The man who performed in high heels and lingerie. Who built an entire persona around gender fluidity and boundary-pushing fashion. Besson wanted him desperately. Prince was intrigued. They met. Prince read the script. He said yes. Then Jean-Paul Gaultier showed him the costume designs. The meeting was a catastrophe. Gaultier presented his vision. Mesh bodysuits where body hair would poke through, plunging necklines, fishnet everything, heels, lace, a costume that revealed more than it covered. Prince sat silently, didn't say a word. Gaultier, trying to explain, started slapping his own buttocks to demonstrate how the rear of the costume would function, how the netting would expose skin. Prince gave him what Gaultier later described as a Charlie Chaplin look, dead-eyed, silent. Then Prince stood up, signaled his bodyguard, and left. Later, through intermediaries, the message came back, too effeminate, even for me. And there's a darker comedy to this. Gaultier's thick French accent meant that when he kept saying faux cul, French for fake butt, Prince thought he was hearing fuck you over and over. So Prince walked. Scheduling conflicts with his tour became the official excuse. Chris Tucker got the call. He also hated the costumes. Later admitted, if he'd known what he'd be wearing, he probably would have turned it down too. But Tucker said yes, squeezed into the latex, became Ruby Road. And Prince, years later, he met Tucker at a club in LA, told him directly, "I was supposed to play that part, but I didn't like the costumes." Tucker responded, "But you got your butt hanging out of your pants." Prince smiled, "But this is my design." Bruce Willis was broke. Mel Gibson walked away. Casting Korben Dallas was a nightmare. Studios wanted Mel Gibson, fresh off Braveheart, bankable, safe. But Gibson read the script and essentially said, "Too weird." He wanted a darker, more violent film. Besson refused to change the tone, so Gibson walked. That left Bruce Willis, who was, at the time, struggling. Hudson Hawk bombed. Billy Bathgate bombed. Studios were afraid to insure him. He was considered risky. But Willis loved the script, loved Besson's vision, and he needed a win. So he took a pay cut, agreed to do it for less than his usual rate just to be part of this insane French sci-fi experiment, and it saved his career. The film's international success reminded everyone Willis could carry a blockbuster. With Gibson, The Fifth Element would have been grittier, angrier, more traditionally masculine. With Willis, it had that smirking, self-aware energy that made the whole thing work. Gary Oldman did it out of guilt. Gary Oldman playing Zorg is unforgettable. That plastic helmet, the accent, the twitchy villainy. But he didn't want the role, didn't understand the script. Later publicly admitted, "I can't bear it." So why'd he do it? Debt. In the mid-90s, Oldman wanted to direct Nil by Mouth, a devastating autobiographical film about domestic violence. No studio would touch it. Luc Besson financed it, believed in Oldman's vision, gave him the money to make his dream project. So when Besson called asking Oldman to play a sci-fi villain in a plastic hat, Oldman couldn't say no. He later described it as singing for my supper, payback. He showed up, delivered one of the most peculiar villain performances in film history, then went home and tried to forget about it. In a 2014 interview, when asked if he liked The Fifth Element, Oldman said, "Oh no, I can't bear it." Fans adored him. Besson got his villain. Oldman got his guilt paid off. Everyone wins, sort of. They searched the world and found an alien. Casting Lilu required finding someone who didn't feel entirely human. Thousands auditioned. Elizabeth Berkley came in. Other established actresses tried. Everyone brought their version of alien warrior woman, but they all felt too Hollywood, too polished, too obviously performing. Then Milla Jovovich walked in. She was 20 years old, a supermodel. She'd done a few small films. She spoke 4 languages fluently: Russian, Serbian, French, and broken English. And according to Besson, the moment she entered the room, everyone knew. She didn't try to act alien. She just was. Something about her energy, her movement, the way she processed language, it felt genuinely otherworldly. They cast her on the spot. Turned out to be the right call. Jovovich brought this childlike wonder mixed with physical intensity that made Lilu iconic. She was also young, impressionable, and about to become the center of a very messy behind-the-scenes drama. The director's wife watched her marriage end in real time. The blue alien diva singing that impossible opera, that's Mai Wen. And she was Luc Besson's wife. Well, sort of. It's complicated and deeply troubling. Mai Wen met Besson when she was 12 years old. He was 29. They started dating when she was 15. She gave birth to their daughter when she was 16. When filming on The Fifth Element began in early 1996, Mai Wen was 20 years old. She'd already been with Besson for years. They had a child together. Besson cast her as Plava Laguna, the diva, a performance that required standing on 14-inch stilts, encased in latex and foam, singing someone else's voice. And during filming, Besson fell for his 21-year-old lead actress, Milla Jovovich. It started small, language lessons, Besson teaching Milla the divine language he'd invented, Long days together on set, late rehearsals, shared obsession with the character. By the time shooting wrapped, Besson had left Mai Wen. No scandal, no public drama, just a quiet separation. Mai Wen went on to become an acclaimed director herself, made deeply personal films about trauma and family dysfunction, never spoke publicly about The Fifth Element. Besson and Milla got married, divorced 2 years later. And if you watch the diva scene now, knowing what was happening behind the camera, a wife performing in her husband's film while he falls for someone else, it's almost unbearable. They invented a language to hide their affair. The divine language Lilu speaks? It's real. Sort of. Besson created it. About 400 words, full grammar rules, syntax, logic. He taught it to Milla. They practiced together, refined it, made it flow naturally, and then they started using it for something else. Love letters, private conversations, notes passed on set that no one else could read. The language became their secret code, a way to communicate while surrounded by crew members, including Besson's wife. By the end of filming, Besson and Milla could hold full conversations in divine language, no translator needed. The affair was hiding in plain sight, wrapped in an alien tongue. The romance ended, the language stayed. Every word Lilu speaks in the film is technically accurate to the language Besson built. A language born from obsession, used for secrecy, and now immortalized in one of the strangest sci-fi films ever made. Alright, if your jaw is on the floor right now, hit that like button, drop a comment and tell me which fact has your head spinning. The teenage affair, the secret language, or Prince turning down fishnets. And hey, if you want more stories like this, subscribe. We're just getting warmed up. Milla became an action star by refusing a stunt double. That corridor fight where Lilu demolishes a dozen armed soldiers? That's Milla. Not a stunt double, not CGI trickery. Milla Jovovich, at 21 years old, insisted on doing her own stunts. She trained for months, learned wire work, choreographed fight sequences, worked with the stunt team until the movements became second nature. That hallway sequence, arguably the film's most visually stunning action moment, was performed almost entirely by Jovovich herself. She got bruised, exhausted, pushed her body beyond what was safe. But she wanted Lilu to feel real, wanted audiences to see an actual human being performing these impossible movements, and it worked. That fight scene still holds up today because there's weight to it. Real physics, actual consequences. No one expected a supermodel turned actress to commit that hard, but Milla proved everyone wrong. 1 designer, 1,000 costumes, 5,000 sketches. Jean-Paul Gaultier was at the peak of his powers in 1996. Madonna's cone bra designer, fashion revolutionary, absolute legend. Besson wanted him for one reason. No one else could imagine the future like Gaultier. What Gaultier delivered was unprecedented. Over 1,000 individual costumes, each one designed from scratch. Every alien race with its own aesthetic. Every background extra with a unique outfit. According to curators who later exhibited his work, those 1,000 costumes represent about 10 full fashion collections. Gaultier likely created 5,000 sketches before narrowing them down. And he didn't just design them, he personally checked each one. Every morning on set during the Helliston Paradise sequence, Gaultier inspected 500 costumes worn by extras. McDonald's employees in the film? Full couture. Flight attendants? Completely original designs. Random passengers? Each one wearing a one-of-a-kind piece. The level of detail is absurd. Characters who appear for 3 seconds have costumes that cost thousands of dollars. It wasn't practical. It wasn't economical. But it created a visual texture no other sci-fi film has ever matched. Chris Tucker couldn't sit down for 2 months. Ruby Rhodes' costume looked incredible on screen. Wearing it was torture. Gaultier designed the outfit with a rigid internal structure. Extremely heavy, zero flexibility. Chris Tucker physically could not sit down while wearing it. Between takes, he'd lean against walls, stand perfectly still. Crew members would spray him with water to cool him down. He lost weight during the shoot, not from exercise, but from essentially sweating through 12-hour days in an unbreathable costume. Tucker later admitted, if he'd known what the costume involved, he probably would have turned down the role. But he didn't know, and once he was committed, he pushed through. That manic energy Ruby Rhodes has? Part of that is Tucker genuinely struggling to maintain composure while trapped in haute couture hell. The performance became legendary. The suffering was real. The explosion that almost burned down the set. When the Fhloston Paradise concert hall explodes, that's not CGI. That's a real explosion. The largest indoor detonation ever filmed at that time. They rigged an entire structure to blow. Dozens of cameras. One take, no do-overs. The pyrotechnic team calculated everything perfectly, in theory. What they didn't account for: how quickly the fire would spread. The explosion went off flawlessly. Cameras captured it, and then the fire kept burning. Hotter, faster, moving beyond the planned containment area. It took the crew 25 minutes to extinguish it fully. 25 minutes of genuine panic. Fire marshals scrambling, crew members evacuating. No one was hurt, but it was terrifyingly close. One of the most spectacular action sequences in 90s cinema was also one of the most dangerous productions ever attempted. After that, studios got nervous about practical explosions this size. CGI became the safer option. The Fifth Element holds the record, and probably always will. The hero and villain exist in parallel universes. In most action films, the hero confronts the villain. Big showdown, final battle, face to face. Not here. Bruce Willis and Gary Oldman are both in The Fifth Element. They filmed on the same sets, weeks apart. They never interact, never share the screen, never even come close to meeting. Besson designed it that way deliberately. He wanted the villain operating in his own sphere, unaware the hero even exists. Their paths run parallel. They affect each other's stories, but they never collide. There's one moment, maybe 3 frames, where they pass each other in an elevator lobby. Korben entering, Zorg leaving. Blink and you miss it. Besson believed this made the conflict more interesting, less predictable, more realistic in a weird way. Most audiences didn't even notice, but once you see it, or rather don't see it, you can't unsee the absence. Besson made sci-fi bright, and everyone thought he was insane. Science fiction in the 90s was dark, gritty, shadows and rain, Blade Runner aesthetics everywhere. Besson hated that. He wanted his future bright, colorful, loud, shot in broad daylight. Cinematographer Thierry Arbogast thought he was crazy. Lighting in full daylight means you see every flaw, every imperfection. Nothing hides, but Besson insisted. Flying taxi chases in sunshine, explosions in white corridors, action sequences in blazing blue skies. It forced the production design to be perfect. Every costume, every prop, every set piece had to withstand full scrutiny, and it worked. The Fifth Element looks unlike any other sci-fi film precisely because Besson refused to hide anything in shadow. The film is aggressive in its brightness, almost assaultive, and that became its signature. The diva sang notes that human biology can't produce. The diva's opera is the emotional centerpiece of the film. It's also biologically impossible. Composer Eric Serra wrote the aria, brought it to Albanian soprano Inva Mula. She looked at the sheet music and smiled. "Some of these notes can't be sung," she told him. "The human voice doesn't change pitch that fast." So they cheated. Mula recorded individual notes in isolation. Serra then digitally edited them together, pitch shifting, time stretching, creating vocal runs that no living person could perform. The result is one of the most haunting pieces of music in cinema, and also one of the most artificial. It sounds operatic, it sounds emotional, it sounds human, but it's fundamentally impossible. Art through technology, beauty through deception. A forklift almost destroyed the film's best scene. The diva sequence took weeks to film. Complex choreography, massive sets, hundreds of extras. They wrapped, sent the film negatives to be processed, and then disaster. At LAX airport during transit, the canisters fell off a truck. A forklift ran over them. Associate producer John Amacarella said he'd never seen anything like it in decades of filmmaking. Film canisters crushed, negatives torn, frames destroyed. The most expensive, most critical scene in the entire movie was potentially gone. The editing team salvaged what they could, pieced together enough footage to cut the scene. But it was terrifyingly close. If the forklift had hit at a slightly different angle, the diva sequence would have been lost forever. They would have had to either reshoot, blowing the budget beyond recovery, or cut the scene entirely. The film as we know it nearly didn't exist, saved by inches. The diva actress performed on stilts above an orchestra pit. Mai Wen didn't just wear a foam suit as the diva, she wore 14-inch stilts, encased in latex, unable to sit, bend, or move naturally. And she had to perform at the Royal Opera House in London, on a real stage, above a real orchestra pit. One wrong step and she'd plunge into the pit, potentially breaking bones, definitely ruining the costume. Production designer Dan Weil later recalled, "We were shooting at night, worrying the latex would peel off, or if she stepped forward too far, she'd scream and disappear into the orchestra pit." Mai Wen never faltered, never complained. She stood there, elevated, motionless, while her husband directed someone else, while her marriage crumbled. The performance is brief, but knowing what it required, physically and emotionally, makes it devastating. America rejected it. The world made it legendary. When The Fifth Element premiered at Cannes in 1997, critics booed. Roger Ebert gave it a lukewarm review. Variety called it a misfired European attempt at sci-fi. It opened in the US to decent but unspectacular numbers, made only $63 million domestically against its $90 million budget. By American standards, it was a disappointment, but internationally, different story entirely. Europe went wild for it. Asia embraced it. 75% of the film's total earnings came from outside the US. It became the highest-grossing French film ever made at the time. Over $200 million internationally. Total worldwide, $263 million. In France specifically, over 7 million people saw it in theaters. It remained the top French film for 16 years. American critics dismissed it as frivolous, overblown nonsense. Everyone else saw it as revolutionary. The disconnect was total, and eventually, even in America, younger audiences discovered it on home video. It became a cult phenomenon specifically because critics hated it. The premiere party cost more than some entire films. Gaumont, the production company, spent between $1 and $3 million on the Cannes premiere party, a record at the time. They built a custom venue, over 100,000 square feet, invited 1,000 guests. Each guest received a custom Swatch watch as their entrance ticket. The party included a futuristic ballet performance, a Jean-Paul Gaultier fashion show, fireworks over the Mediterranean, and a full dinner for everyone. Why spend this much? Strategy. Bruce Willis couldn't promote the film worldwide, so Gaumont brought the entire world to France. Every international distributor, every major journalist, 2 days of concentrated press, all in one place. The gamble paid off. The international distribution deals made the film's global success possible. Sometimes you have to spend millions to make hundreds of millions. A schoolgirl's homework unlocked everything. For years, Besson knew his story was missing something. He had the action, the world, the characters, but not the theme, not the why. Then one night, his 13-year-old sister asked for help with homework. She was studying Plato, Greek philosophy, the classical elements, earth, water, fire, air, and the fifth element, the human soul, love, consciousness. Besson read it and everything clicked. That's exactly what I'm missing, he realized. The entire philosophical framework of the fifth element came from a teenager's philosophy textbook. Everything Lilu represents, the power of love as a weapon, the idea that humanity itself is the ultimate force, all rooted in Plato's ancient theory of existence. Besson joked years later, "When I see Plato in heaven, I'll apologize for stealing his book." One homework assignment, one chapter, 20 years of work suddenly made sense. Multipass entered the cultural lexicon by accident. Multipass was never meant to be a thing. It's just a word Lilu says a few times. Broken English, mispronounced. But audiences latched onto it, started repeating it, quoting it, turning it into shorthand for access granted. Now it appears in Borderlands, in Cyberpunk 2077, in dozens of games and films as Easter eggs. It's become a permanent piece of nerd culture vocabulary. One throwaway line, said maybe 5 times total, became more famous than half the actual plot. The fifth element shouldn't have worked. A French director adapting his teenage fantasy novel. A $90 million budget in 1997. A cast that included a pop superstar who walked away, a wife being replaced in real time, and a comedian who couldn't physically sit down. Critics hated it. America ignored it. Studios called it a failure. And yet, it became one of the most influential sci-fi films of the 90s. Spawned a cult following that still obsesses over every detail 25 years later. Because sometimes the messiest productions create the most unforgettable art. So, have you already watched The Fifth Element? Tell us in the comments what you think about it and which of these facts you already knew. And if you liked this video, hit that like button. Subscribe for more deep dives into films that changed everything. Thanks for watching.